Hello, and welcome to the Way of the Lion Narnian Apologetics course. In this session, we're going to consider the Silver Chair. This is the last of the Caspian trilogy, and the fourth book published. I have subtitled this section, The Lunacy of Atheism, which deserves some brief comment. I am not, as some have misunderstood me, saying that all atheists are insane. Rather, I'm alluding to Michael Ward's theory that the silver chair is linked to the moon, or luna. Within my interpretation, it relates to a spell of atheist propaganda with special reference to university-age young people. We will examine both the spell and how to break it. But in this session, we are examining the spell. Our aims in this video are to consider the spell from the Narnian's perspective of the Green Witch or Queen of Underland or Lady of the Green Kirtle, the Round World English perspective of Feuerbach, Freud and Marx, and examine some anti-Christian arguments which rely on the spell. I've mentioned a spell a few times now, so what do I mean by this? I shall let C.S. Lewis explain. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. End quote. When Lewis preached this at the University Church in Oxford in 1942, which has some lovely twisty columns outside, by the way, he may have started the thought process which led to the silver chair, since this is a good summation of the crucial scene where Rilian is freed from his long enchantment by his mother's murderer and resumes his true nature as legitimate prince and heir of Narnia. Like in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Lewis sets up a dichotomy of truth claims. The first is that of the Green Witch, who is then responded to by Puddleglum. Let's first look at the Lady of the Green Kirtle. This duplicitous character typifies the corruption of 20th century thought, which so horrified and revolted Lewis. In her conversation with the party of heroes, she uses various magical techniques to bring them under her spell. Green powder and smoke, music, and arguments. These things can be compared with real-world challenges and attacks which the Christian apologist needs to meet or a youth leader needs to inoculate against. Starting with powder and smoke. When she had come to a little ark set in the wall, not far from the fireplace, she opened it and took out first a handful of green powder. This she threw on the fire. It did not blaze much, but made a very sweet and drowsy smell. And all through the conversation which followed, that smell grew stronger and filled the room and made it harder to think. End quote. This powder was green, like the moon's vestal livery which none but fools to wear, according to Romeo. We could legitimately say that the party were literally breathing in lunacy. The zeitgeist, which we discussed in Prince Caspian, is so pervasive that every input we have, be it TV, films, news reports, popular music lyrics, or even the education system, are infused with an anti-Christian worldview. Though any one input is minimal and easily ignored, taken as a whole it creates a fugue which is constantly inhaled, making it harder to think outside the parameters of the approved truth claims. A good, albeit extreme, alternative picture of this might be that of Orwell's 1984. Quoting again, "Secondly, she took out a musical instrument, rather like a mandolin. She began to play it with her fingers, a steady, monotonous thrumming that you didn't notice after a few minutes. But the less you noticed it, the more it got into your brain and your blood. This also made it hard to think. When I was writing my dissertation, I desperately tried to find some connection between a mandolin and the moon. The best I could come up with was an obscure line from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing and it having a semi-spherical shape. What is a much clearer connection is between the constant hypnotic thrumming and the insidious undercurrent of anti-spiritual bias in so much of our popular culture. Taken together, the smoke and the music, or zeitgeist and bias, form a barrier to belief in real things and foment an atmosphere where only one voice can be heard. Thereafter, she starts her attack. I quote again. After she had thrummed for a time, and the sweet smell was now strong, she began speaking in a sweet, quiet voice. End quote. The Queen attacks on 3 grounds, each time looking as if it is a defence. She leads them to make truth claims, and then sows doubt and denial through a hard-to-refute combination of straw men, genetic fallacies, infantilizing, and reductio ad absurdum. First, she denies Narnia, Overworld, Rillian's position, and also our world, where Eustace and Jill are from. Then she subtly inserts her own increasingly likely-sounding worldview, that hers is the only world. Puddleglum then rallies, reminding them all of the sun and the stars. But this abstract concept is waved away with genetic fallacy. The third and final attempt to address the witch's argument is to invoke Aslan. This is treated to the same reductio ad absurdum, making Aslan himself into a kitty cat, rather like an atheist troll referring to God Almighty as Sky Daddy. As the spell reaches completion, all of the humans are agreeing that there is no world but Underland, and certainly no Aslan. Next time we will deal with Puddleglum's response to this, but for this time let's consider this spell. The last slide mentioned something called bulverism. This form of argumentation is what Lewis calls bulverism, from an essay of the same name with the telling subtitle, The Foundation of 20th Century Thought. This term stems from the fictional account of Ezekiel Bulver, who, on hearing his mother say to his father, who had been maintaining that 2 sides of a triangle were together greater than the third, "Oh, you say that because you are a man," and thus determined that refutation is no necessary part of argument. Assume that your opponent is wrong, and then explain his error, and the world will be at your feet. This presuppositional approach is one found throughout Freudian, Marxist, and Feuerbachian thought, which pervades modern academia. Bulverism is a form of the genetic fallacy, which we examined with reference to Richard Dawkins in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe section of this course. At the risk of repeating myself, the genetic fallacy is explaining the origin of a belief in an attempt to discredit or bypass it. For example, the belief that the Earth goes around the Sun is fairly universally agreed upon, but a geocentrist, who believes the Earth is the centre of the universe, might argue that since you learnt this from a child's science book, which made other erroneous claims in the name of educational simplification, such as atomic models with little balls and connectors to explain chemistry, then this belief is likewise erroneous and does not need to be engaged. Richard Dawkins does this by saying to Western Christians that if they had been born in other parts of the world, they would believe different things about God. This is irrelevant to the discussion of God's existence and serves only to shut down honest debate. Dawkins uses this anti-intellectual tactic from a Darwinian evolutionary standpoint. But he's not alone. It existed in other disciplines long before the God delusion, We're going to look at it in the fields of philosophy, psychology, and economics. Starting with Feuerbach and philosophy. In the field of philosophy, there is a student of Hegel and inspiration of Marx called Ludwig von Feuerbach, here pictured with a badger on his chin. He influenced other further thinkers such as Engels and Nietzsche with his most famous work, The Essence of Christianity, in the original German, Das Wesen des Christentums. This work broadly argues that God is humanity's best aspects writ large. He wrote, I quote, "It is not, as in the Bible, that God created man in his own image, but on the contrary, man created God in his own image." I should really have done that in a Bavarian accent because he was a Bavarian, but I have such love of Bavaria and Bavarians that I couldn't possibly besmirch them by putting those ridiculous words in their accent. This is a faith position, in that it is a hypothesis yet to be proven by evidence. Indeed, no evidence would serve to prove or disprove this theory to those who fervently support or reject it. Thus it is a blind faith position. Despite the irrational nature of this argument, it gained surprising support in modern and postmodern anti-Christian thought in the early and mid-20th century. The pervasive effects of this atheistic faith are still being felt thanks to later proponents and modifiers of the theory. It also carried over into other disciplines. One such discipline which became influenced by Feuerbach was psychology, thanks to the considerable influence of Sigmund Freud. Freud wrote with great confidence that, "At bottom, God is nothing other than an exalted Father." Also, the derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it seems to me to be incontrovertible. Both of these statements may or may not be true, but they in no way address the truthfulness of any religious or spiritual claim being made. Indeed, if God did indeed design humankind for a relationship with him as Father, then it would surely be expected that we would have just such a need inherent in each of us. Thus, explaining the root of religion as having this need stops short of explaining the need itself and circles us round to conclude the central claims of Christianity. Lewis was familiar with much of Freud's work. He wrote of it in Book 3, Chapter 4 of Mere Christianity. I quote, "Now, you want to distinguish very clearly between two things, between the actual medical theories and technique of the psychoanalysts and the general philosophical view of the world which Freud and some others have gone on to add to this. The second thing, the philosophy of Freud, is in direct contradiction to Christianity, and also in direct contradiction to the other great psychologist, Jung. And furthermore, when Freud is talking about how to cure neurotics, he is speaking as a specialist on his own subject. But when he goes on to talk general philosophy, he is speaking as an amateur. It's therefore quite sensible to attend to him with respect in the one case and not in the other. And that is what I do. I'm all the readier to do it because I have found that when he is talking of his own subject, talking off his own subject and on a subject I do know something about, namely language, he is very ignorant. But psychoanalysis itself, apart from all the philosophical additions that Freud and others have made to it, is not in the least contradictory to Christianity." End quote. Freudianism is frequently addressed in Lewis's allegory Pilgrim's Regress. For example, when the personification of reason breaks down the prison of giant spirit of the ages door, while the prisoners wail, "Wish fulfillment!" and refuse to be rescued. The character who led the hero into said prison in the first place was Sigismund Enlightenment, who was based on Sigmund Freud. We can afford some sympathy to Freud since his childhood was fairly messed up and he may have been sexually abused, which would lead naturally to some of his more outlandish theories. His own loss of respect for his father is likely behind his desire to denigrate the belief in an eternal, loving Father, God. But this explanation of the origin of his belief does not address the belief itself, lest I be accused of bulverism. Another area which was impacted by Feuerbach's bulverism was economics, via Karl Marx, the least funny of the Marx brothers. Marx is most famous for his belief in the economics of oppression, the concept that anyone with any power, wealth or influence got to that position by oppressing other people. Though there may be some truth in individual cases, it is a stretch too far to extend this to a general view of the world. It was certainly true of Marx's later followers, who rose to prominence by the oppression and murder of the Russian ruling classes. Today, Marxism is held by a wide variety of educators, politicians, and entertainers, which means it has sunk into the general psyche of the masses. Aspects of it are held religiously by many people who believe themselves to be oppressed by anyone with whom they disagree. To be clear here, I'm not denying that oppression occurs, nor am I undermining the struggle of many people who are oppressed. Indeed, the whole of Prince Caspian's section of this course was about witnessing to the oppressed by means of presenting a better worldview and their place within it. But like so many things, it has been detracted from by overuse. Thus, anyone who makes a critical comment about a homosexual is a homophobe, and discussion shuts down. Anyone deigning to critique the doctrines of Islam is an Islamophobe, and discussion shuts down. Anyone questioning radical feminism must be a misogynist, and discussion shuts down. Political correctness of this type runs against the ability to have open and honest discussions of any controversial issue. It's very much like what the demon Screwtape describes in a toast he proposes about diabolical democracy. And I quote, "What I want to fix your attention on is the vast overall movement towards the discrediting and finally the elimination of every kind of human excellence, moral, cultural, social or intellectual. And is it not pretty to notice how democracy, in the incantatory sense, is now doing for us the work that was once done by the most ancient dictatorships, and by the same methods? You remember how one of the Greek dictators, they called them tyrants then, sent an envoy to another dictator to ask his advice about the principles of government. The second dictator led the envoy into a field of corn, and there he snicked off with his cane the top of every stalk that rose an inch or so above the general level. The moral was plain: allow no preeminence among your subjects. Let no man live who is wiser or better or more famous or even handsomer than the masses. Cut them all down to a level, all slaves, all ciphers, all nobodies, all equals. Thus tyrants could practice, in a sense, democracy. But now democracy can do the same work without any other tyranny than her own. No one need now go through the field with a cane. The little stalks will now of themselves bite the tops off the big ones. The big ones are beginning to bite off their own in their desire to be like stalks." End quote. In a diabolically democratic paradigm, say that 10 times fast, any open, honest debate is shut down, just as Marxist, Freudian, Feuerbachian bulverists desire, lest the debater grow higher than the masses and encourages the listener's free thought and dissent from the prescribed view. Now it's your turn. You may have heard various bulveristic claims in your conversations with skeptics and anti-Christians. Here I offer some of my favourites. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to offer a response. Assess its relevance for the sake of argument, grant the premise, and ask the "so what" question. Pause the video for discussion and then I will give you my perspective. Let's go. Christianity is a crutch for the weak. Press pause and discuss. Does this address the central claims of the Christian faith? Does it interact with the historicity or significance of Jesus' life, death and resurrection? Clearly not. It is a veiled ad hominem attack, which is not worth refuting. But let's say it is true. Say that Christianity attracts the broken and weary of the world. Isn't that exactly what Jesus said would be the case? I tell my daughter that asking for help is a sign of strength. A crutch is precisely there to give support where needed. And if that is what the church is, if that is what the church is doing, then it is an invaluable addition to society. If true, this is a great claim to be able to make. Christians are hypocrites. Press pause and discuss. Can this be applied anywhere else? Doctors who smoke are hypocrites. Should we not heed their advice? Lawyers who do legally questionable things are hypocrites. But don't we talk to them when we fall into legal bother? Prisoners who despise and condemn other convicts are hypocrites. Should we take away their prison guard? There is, of course, an inescapable truth here. Christians say don't sin, and yet are self-proclaimed sinners saved by grace. Jesus said himself that it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. So if a Christian is not a hypocrite, then Christianity would have nothing to offer anyone. On the other hand, it is important to point out that the commands that Christians are telling the world to obey come not from themselves, but from God, who has the only right to issue them. So what? This is, at heart, just another thinly veiled ad hominem. It is true, but it is not insulting at all to be told that we hold to higher ideals than the general populace, even if we can't always live up to them ourselves. Christianity is geographically defined. Press pause and discuss. This statement is powerfully false. Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion which spread first to Africa with Philip, then to India with Thomas, and then to Europe via Rome with Paul. Centuries later, we Europeans took it with us to our colonies, like America. The spread of Christianity was the organic growth of an idea, which is why there are Christians of every tribe, tongue and nation on earth today. This is an irrelevant statement, by dint of being factually false. But let us imagine that it were true, that Christianity had never spread out of Israel. Would that make it false? Well, it might make us question why God didn't allow a persecution to spread the message around, or make use of the ebb and flow of pilgrims to Jerusalem, as happened in the actual history. But the principal concept of God becoming man and dying to atone for our sins remains unaffected by this counterfactual scenario. You just want it to be true, so you imagine that it is. Press pause and discuss. This is a straw man of the argument from desire. Straw men are a mischaracterization or oversimplification of an argument which can then be refuted without actually engaging with the actual argument. This is one which I experienced on Facebook while writing the original Way of the Lion. I've also had it levelled against me by an old friend in the pub. It does not engage the truth claim to the slightest degree. For example, when HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs for those not of a British origin, send me a tax rebate, I want the letter to be true, but that won't affect my bank account. Similarly, if I hear of the death of a loved one, I really don't want it to be true, and yet I will never converse with that person again this side of eternity. With the God hypothesis, I really didn't want it to be true, so I could continue living any way I pleased with no obligation to a higher power. But I, like Lewis himself, had to conclude that the evidence all pointed to a divine conclusion, and specifically towards Christianity. Now that I have experienced the benefit of being a Christian and seen the power and personhood of God firsthand, I do very much want it to be true, but that is only because it is true. Now, what if this statement were true, that my faith were merely a Freudian wish fulfillment? Would this indicate that it is untrue? Only if there were no corroborating evidence, such as the letter from the HMRC or the certificate of death. Fortunately, my faith follows firm fact, not fluid feeling, so this claim is fatuous. Would you like that again? Fortunately, my faith follows firm fact, not fluid feeling, so this claim is fatuous. You're welcome. The Bible is homophobic, misogynistic, intolerant, violent, and unscientific. Pause and discuss. Is this true? Well, from a certain perspective, it partly is. If you classify homophobic as saying that homosexual sex is wrong, misogynistic as saying that women and men are designed differently for different roles, intolerant as saying that one perspective is right and another is by definition wrong, violent as describing past acts of violence, and unscientific as not subscribing to every theory that is published, then the Bible is guilty as charged. However, from other perspectives, the Bible would be seen as a radically liberating, peaceful, and miraculously accurate text. This is only relevant from a fallen human perspective and measured against a sin-biased standard. The response would be to offer a higher, better, more reasonable standard of measurement. What if this charge were true? Would it invalidate the Bible as a standard of measurement? Not really. It would only say that it does not cohere with the speaker's fairly arbitrary personal standard of measurement. That's the end of the exercise. If you have enjoyed this type of exercise, then I recommend the YouTube channel What Do You Meme?, which takes popular atheist memes and subjects them to a rational critique, and then closes by asking, what do you meme? Please leave other similar thoughts in the comment section for community interaction. Our aims in this video were to consider the spell from the Narnian perspective of the Green Witch, or Queen of Underland, or Lady of the Green Kirtle, which we did with reference to the elements of powder and smoke, music, and argumentation. The round world English perspective, which we assessed in terms of the Bulverism in Feuerbach's philosophy, Freud's psychology, and Marx's economics, and examine some anti-Christian arguments which rely on the spell, which we did with some meme-tastic statements which were shown to not hold water. If you feel that we've met these aims together, then please consider liking this video to promote it to people with similar interest to yourself. If you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to be informed of the next episode, when we will consider ways to break the spell. Until then, let us live as much like a Narnian as we can.